I'm very happy to be here. I was with you in Rio a few months ago, and that was a stunning time and just great to work with you. And of course, very happy to see everyone again. So I just loved Jose's talk, and I want to now take his perspective and put it forward 500 years. So we want to go to the year 2500. So I think that's a great way to end the day, the really long-term future. And so put on your long-term futures hat if you can. So I want to, if you can now go to the next slide. So yesterday I was presenting to the largest law enforcement organization in the world. And we were having a discussion, of course, on the future. And I talked about that we're at again, using what Jose was saying, tipping point, that actually the most important capability, the most important product, if you like, the most important value of international policing is trust. So when you lose trust, you lose everything. The community has to trust you. And the head of that organization, and you can figure out who I'm talking about, he said, "You're right, but I live in an organization with nation states, and it's about interests." So trust takes us one way, how to deal better with the community, as Jose is saying, the public commons. Interests are about, wait a second, we all have separate interests. How do we resolve those? And those can be resolved in different ways, and some can be very poorly done, and some can be very badly done. So let's take that as the core tension that we all live with. We want a trust world, but we're in a situation of contradictions, 8 billion people with many nation states with different interests. So let's go to the first slide. So this is very much what I take. Isn't it here that you take a half step wrong and wake up 1,000 miles astray? So this is very much saying that there's choices to be made here. We can go this way, we can go that way. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about that. So this is what's called the great bifurcation. In a book, Evolution's Edge by Graham Taylor, he talks about that. Do we go higher level complexity, a higher order planet, or do we fragment within nation states between our own minds in terms of mental illness and between nation states? So these are some course decisions, possibilities we have in the next 500 years. So let's explore that further. So this is, you go to the next one. This is kind of, yes, that's perfect. This is kind of, so this is what's called the Great Despair. The Great Despair is what will COVID-19 lead to? Fracturing of nations, 7 to 10 year depression, total loss of trust among people, the loss of any possibility commons. Now, the second opportunity is the next slide. Will it be to the Great Despair, or if you go, Jaqueline, forward, will it create something called the Global Health Awakening? Health, education, knowledge based on the person at the center. So we have prosperity, which we still want to increase the amount of goods and services for people all over the world, but we have basically planet based on the planet, and we have people based on inclusion, and of course, purpose. If you're in a wealthy organization, you may have prosperity, but if you don't have purpose, you're bored. If you don't have people, you're unable to respond as the world changes because you're exclusive. If you don't have planet, doesn't matter how rich you are, there's no nature base for it. So COVID-19 starts us on this possibly for a 100-year journey on what would a global health awakening look like with the person at the center, using precision medicine, prevention, partnership, and participation. And I think those are all the comments that Jose talked about. So let's go forward. So this is kind of the things we're discovering. Will this person, and many people like him, survive the next year? Onwards. Next slide. And then we start to think about, or are we on the road to a new world? Where we start to look at the inclusion and start to think, who have we excluded? How do we bring them in? And all of us have personal stories of that, many and some far more, who've been far more excluded and brutally. But the goal finally is to go something towards new humanism. And this is very difficult. It's a new humanism as a practice. Meaning in situations every day, do I see the world from only my own family, only my own religion, only my own country, or do I see it from a global humanist, including nature view? That's easy in theory, but every day we're confronted and I say, oh, why am I responding this way? Do I like this person because he or she looks like me, or do I like them because we're actually going to a deeper sense of who they are? So this is not a theory. This is a daily practice that we have, that I feel we have to do, and that's the next step of human evolution. Next slide, please. So this is the notion of the Gaian civilizations. So you will look at this, imagining this the next 500 years, the next 1,000 years. This was done by, we were part of a group called the Year 3000, and it was funded a 1,000-year project. And among the things we talked about, okay, what would this 1,000-year project look like? So you can see planet is there, humans are there, spirit is holding it, and the ancestors are there. So it's an imagination of a spirit, nature, people, a new type of Gaian civilization. Or we could do something else. Let's go to the next slide. If you go to the next one, this is science and technology rules. This is the other imagination of the year 3000. I'm sorry, go backwards one.
Okay.
This is the yes, perfect, thank you. This is the 1,000-year imagination. Now look at this. This is from nature to leaving Earth. It's science and technology. If you look at the people there, they're just heads. They don't have their bodies. So they're disconnected from who they are. If you look at the image there, it's really much the male at the center below the sun over Earth. So those are almost our two choices. Do you go this way? Do you go that way? Next slide. And so we started to explore this question. We thought, well, futures is about the imagination, but maybe there's some deep structures, some deep patterns we have to work with. So this is a book I did with Johann Khaldun, and this is Macrohistory, Macrohistorians. And this is book one of a trilogy. There's 3 books on it. The second is Understanding Sarkar, and the third is Situating Sarkar. But they're all trying to ask the question, not just 5, 20, 30, 40, are there 50-year cycles, 100-year waves, 500-year patterns? So you can't just say, here's the future I want. If there's a huge tsunami, a deep pattern that's foundational, you have to resolve that. So let's think about that. Next one. So as we focused on that, next slide, please, we found there's 20 patterns at least, but there's 4 foundational. And this is perfect. No. Yeah, perfect, perfect. The first one, if we look at Khaldun, this is a cyclical pattern that we see decline over generations, over 40 years, 100 years, sometimes even earlier 30 years. We have Herbert Spencer saying, no, the long-term 500-year pattern is differentiation, progress, more technology. Auguste Comte says, in fact, that's the next phase. In the next 100 years, continuing from what he spoke about to at least the 22nd century, we go from religious systems, rational systems, to scientific systems. Sorokin comes in and says, well, maybe not, maybe there's pendulums. Toynbee says, as we jump to this new civilization, who's the leading edge? Are we the leading edge as futurists? Who are the ones that start to imagine and create this new future? There's, of course, commons, but there's always people at the leading edge that see things that others can't do, and they make the step. And Sarkar talks about what do those leaders look like? And Carter just takes us into a different way of thinking. So let's go through some of these. Next one. So we start with Ibn Khaldun. He says you survive by unity. So yes, you have a common, but you have core unity. You see the future in a shared way. You've worked hard together and you work towards that new future. So difficulty creates unity. Unity gets you over the next step. But he says, but once you're in power, we always exclude others. The ones we exclude come in and challenge our system, leading to creative destruction. As they destroy the new system, then of course there's degeneration over 4 generations, if sometimes sooner. So the great leader, the followers follow the great leader. By generation 3, they're just looking at the text. By generation 4, it's basically corruption. And we see that in country after country. So he says, think about the next 500 years. What are the cycles of degeneration? And next one then. So that's Khaldun's. But think about the cycles. Now after Khaldun, the next thinker, next one. This is, of course, what Khaldun says. And this is where we get confused. And this Jose pointed that out. It looks like the system will last forever. And he says, look at the metaphor of the wick. Just before it disappears, it actually gets brighter even more. In fact, we think it's forever, but it's about to go out. So this is the mistake we often make. Based on the data at the moment, we think it will go forever. But in fact, the data suggests it's about it. Data on the opposite suggests this could be the end of it, is the decline. Next slide, Jacqueline. So now all the opposite, Comte and Spencer. They say, look at what's increasing. If I go back on my great-grandmother died from the plague. My mother talks about her sister died from smallpox. My grandmother lost 5 brothers and sisters from Spanish flu. And boy, it's a flu from Kansas. So if we go back 100 years, my father's grandmother died from hunger. So he says, don't get lost only in cycles. Generations get better and better through science and technology and medicine and governance. So always keep the idea the future can be better. Next slide. Now the issue for us, will this continue? Will science and technology continue? Will space exploration continue? Are we creating a new global brain? Isn't in fact a global brain, not just a global brain, but a global spirit? So in our book, Asia 2038, we try to explore that. Is the next 100, at least 20, but I would say even 100 years, really about these 4 forces working together to transform the world as we know it? So is the linear set to continue? Khaldun is cyclical. Here's the linear. Next one. And this takes us to Sorokin. Sorokin says, don't get confused between linear and cyclical. In fact, reality is pendulum. Why is it pendulum? There's only a few responses to what's the nature of reality. Is it spirit? Yes. Is it matter? Yes. Is it both? Yes. Can you answer that question? We don't know, but you can't create a society and not being able to answer that question. What's reality? So whenever you go towards one view of reality, last 500 years have been what's called sensate materialistic reality. It was challenging the dark ages where we were counting a number of angels on a pin. So now we've moved to, he's saying, with the next 500 years, we will move towards a spiritual perspective. If we're lucky, we'll integrate it, science and technology, with spirit and consciousness. So this is his pendulum, back and forth. So if you think of the next 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, think about this grand 500 years we've had. And now the next 500 years will be a shift into the spirit. The spirit could be transformational in terms of using science and technology, the commons, or it could go back to the European Middle Ages where the spirit becomes religious dogma. We don't know that. And that question will be a religious dogma or will be transformational, comes out in the next slide, please. So this is his notion, can you create integrated? We don't know if you can create integrated. If you go further, this question, yes, perfect.
No.
Toynbee says, perfect. Toynbee says, will it be dogmatic or will it be transformational? This depends on the creative minority. They're on the leading edge. They come up with the ideas. If they create with openness, authenticity, innovation, you get this leading edge civilization. However, the system responds in 2 ways. It could respond as a bureaucracy. We'll get a world government, which is a huge, huge bureaucratic center. Or the system responds from a world church, a kind of religious perspective. It sees the current sensate civilization falling apart and it reinforces it in a new way. So this is our choice right now. Which way will we go? And that's answered a bit by Sarkar next. Next slide, Jaqueline. He says the way we figure that out is by the Sadvipras. So he has 4 archetypes, 4 patterns in history. The workers who are suppressed by reality. Warriors who challenge reality, use physical power, military power to control reality. Intellectuals, they use knowledge power to gain privilege in society. They use science and technology, but they also use religion. And both can become dogmatic. And then you have capitalist power, which works in terms of innovation, but then when it gets stuck, you have a constipated society with the poor at the bottom. So how do you transform this? Next slide. If we don't do the inner work, the spiritual work, if we don't embrace these 4 archetypes, we get the revolution, which is the cycle. It's not the inner revolution, it just keeps on going. We actually don't change anything. The deep structure of history, the 1,000-year, he says the 5,000-year pattern continues. Next one. So this is his contribution. We have to develop our ability to serve the worker, protect the warrior, the intellectual who inspires, the accumulator of capital who innovates and uses it for wife's purposes. So then in the center, you have Toynbee's creative minority. They're at the leading edge. They're imagining this new future given the structures of the past that we have and that tension we hold. So this is suggesting, irrespective of that tension, the system flips in the next 100, 50, 100, 500 years. We can't say when. Next one. So Kardashev now comes in and says, these are brilliant macro histories. They're based on society, on technology, on reason, on spirit, but you're forgetting one thing. We live in an energy system. We're a type 0 civilization, which needs endless energy, but the governance system is not the commons. It's fractured by ego, religion, nation state. So now we're in this big tension that must be resolved for us to move in the next stage of human evolution. We have to resolve energy needs with governance needs. So he says we have to move to a type 1 civilization. Type 1 civilization uses fossil fuel, it goes from fossil fuel to solar, wind, renewable, and makes the jump to a global governance system, a real health commons, a real nature commons, a real knowledge commons, as Jose said. You're now a type 1 civilization. You have governance, shared reality, solar energy. But we know eventually asteroids will hit, so we go to a type 2 civilization that starts to leave the planet. So there's a debate, well, should I love Earth or should we leave the planet? He's saying you have to do both. First, we have to love Earth, create a Gaian polity, a Gaian economy. Then we have to use new energies to start to go outwards. So in the phase 2, in 1,000 years, we've entered a type 2 civilization, which goes throughout the solar system, uses solar energy, and travels and saves Earth. Eventually, over 10,000 years, we reach a type 3 civilization, meaning we're spirit, we're virtual, we're all over the galaxy. We've resolved the basic contradictions of interest and trust. And once we do that, then we spread everywhere. Hopefully not like a virus, but hopefully in some other way. Next slide. So this now concludes this part. So today we're nation state oriented. Hopefully the next 50 years, we'll have 6, 7 regions, an African Union, an Asian Union, a European Union, a South American Union, et cetera, et cetera. These will be confederations, not unions per se, but confederations, economies of scale, economies of language, though we have multiple languages and interlinked economies. Eventually, 22nd century, we move towards a real world government. We're far from there, but that's the next step if we want to ensure we don't bifurcate and destroy ourselves. Next slide. There's a governance shift, and then there has to be an economic shift. We're capitalist. Clearly, the next phase is economic democracy. We know with the new technologies, we can create platform sharing. So Uber is more efficient, but the profits still go to only the shareholders. The next phase is the profits go to the people who actually work. So this creates platform cooperatives. And eventually with technology, we only need to work, I think, a few hours a day post-scarcity. That's by the 23rd, 24th century. This is, again, this prosperity, people, planet, purpose. Next slide. And so this is the move from the fossil fuels to the global solar energy regime, using peer-to-peer sharing and having global public organizations, that actually resolve the energy sharing. It can't be done on a local level. And of course, nation state leaders will resist this, but we're saying the interest for them will be, do I jump up in terms of evolutionary complexity, or do I go down and fragment? Each person will have to make that decision, and they probably won't jump unless their own electoral lives, their personal lives are being challenged. Next one. And this is the one, of course, we're talking about. All this rests based on a new ecumene, a new way of seeing reality. We've had the 500-year pattern of materialism. It's been fantastic in some ways, but it's avoided the spirit. So this is the mind-body integration, and finally the spiritual episteme. Now, the key is here, even the spiritual episteme, you still need a controlling faculty that's scientific evidence-based. This is not avoiding science. This is bringing spirit consciousness within science and technology. So it's both and type of approach, and it's doable. Next one. So this is the final part of it. None of this is possible without the 5,000-year pattern. What Rainer Eisler said, basically you have a dominator society or you have a partnership society. So gender equity becomes, we know, not just about culture, but societies where there's more gender equity are more prosperous. So this is the 5 big changes we're seeing in the next 500 years. Next slide. And this is the final part. Again, with the Kardashevs, you go from world system, planetary system, to actually the solar system. So that's the kind of the big jump. Next one. Now, who can do this? We're talking big macro historical shifts. So this is a great quote from Bernard Lewin. So this is our role as futurists. Only those who are able to see the invisible are able to do the impossible. So we need to start to imagine this long-term cycle pattern we want, long-term civilization we want. And of course, it could take 100 years, maybe sooner, but we don't know. We can't time it. So we're trying to create this with these waves of change. Next one. Now, is this at all possible? So I conclude with this slide, and this is from my own teacher. And I think his quote was really, given this, that is why I said the future of the human race is not dark, rather is distractingly resplendent. Now, he had the gravitas to say that. He did spend 7 years in jail, 3 to 5 years fasting. So he undertook the difficulty and still, even with all the weights of history smashing him down, started to imagine this amazing future. So part of it was understand the patterns of change and keep on imagining the future we want. And I have suggested that the patterns of change in the long run allow for dramatic evolutionary transformation. Clear in the beginning, it's the bifurcation. We could fragment and mess it up and not go from a type 0 to type 1 civilization. And we could wake up 1,000 miles astray and in tears. Sarkar is saying, no, we have the possibility. Toynbee is saying we're in the leading edge. Spencer's saying, keep on looking the linear part. Khaldun is saying, be aware, be critical, don't allow it to decline. So let's hope and let's work together to create this new 500-year future. Thank you so much.
So amazing, as usual. So I think Simone has questions, two questions for you.
Yes, thank you so much for this outstanding presentation, Sohail. It was great. Thank you so much for being with us. We have a couple of questions. So the first one is, what is the big litany about the world's moment?
The litany? The kind of the challenge. I think it's what the big law enforcement meeting I had yesterday with. One is we're seeing a breakdown into trust. The goal is to create trusting communities. And the trust comes from people feeling they feel heard, feeling they feel safe. So that's the kind of one dimension. So you create a new system based on trust. And the other one is the system based on interest, whether national interest or personal interest. Now, those don't matter so much if it's just a few of us in a room, right? We could have a fight, we work it out. But this is the big litany now, is the trust versus interest is within the framework of 8 billion people and within nature. So it's not like we can just sit around and not resolve it. This is basically the evolutionary jump. I'm hopeful it'll be resolved, but we're in the middle of it, and hopefully we'll go through it. If you're on the interest side, of course you want to keep our interest. We all want to keep our interest. So do we trust and create something else? And that's basically where we're at, and I hope we transform. Thank you.
Thank you. And another one, Bibiana asks, why is space exploration needed for human evolution?
Okay, so this is a crucial part. So if you look at the Carter shift cycle, Sarkar, they're saying, of course, Gaia first. Make your planet clean, green, safe, gender equity, all those things are first. But the other part of what it means to be humans, whether I'm a colleague of mine, Maori Karik, he's writing about the Maoris were the voyagers, the explorers. As humans, we're voyagers and explorers. That purpose base of exploring the unknown is not going to stop. We are going to go, we will go beyond the planet. Now, just from a risk mitigation view, right? If you know something's coming at you, you create scenarios to avoid risk. We know the planet Earth will be at risk, whether because the climate or asteroids coming. You have to have a plan C and plan D. And also the process of doing that creates purpose. But that doesn't mean you avoid the problems on Earth. You solve them first. Some people do the space stuff, living 500 years transhumanism, because they're afraid of death. They're deeply afraid of their mortality, so they wish to escape. So they're afraid of the death to Earth, so they wish to escape. That's not my argument. This is purpose-based, voyager-based, the deep story of who we are as a species. We all came from a little village in Africa, right? All of us. We all left because we want to voyage and explore and go elsewhere. reduce risk, enhance possibility. That's not going to stop.
Do we have time for more questions, Jaqueline?
Yes, please. This one, I think it's there is a question. When you mean spirituality, you are not talking about religion. This is easy. And there is one from Fernando from Peru.
So for me, for spirituality, it has 4 parts. Part 1 is this practice. It's a daily practice. Meditation, prayer, whatever. It's calming the mind. It's a practice. Part 2, it's a relationship with the transcendent. It could be immanent transcendent. It could be whatever you want to call the transcendent. It's a relationship. Part 3 is based on inclusion. It can't be you're above, someone's below. That goes back to religion. Who has the truth, who doesn't? So it's immanent and it's inclusive. So if you put that together, you start to see the core difference. Now, Khaldun says it starts at spirit and becomes religion, right? The dogma sets in. So this is the 4th part of spirituality. It's called critical spirituality. We're not losing our intellect. The sharp intellect, pinnacle intellect that's focused creates intuition, creates the jump into spirit. So this is the 4, the practice, the inclusion, the transcendental, and critical accounting. So we're not forgetting ourselves as intellectual scholars. It's plus, plus, plus. So that's very different from what we had in every civilization. It starts at spirit, ends up in dogma. So this is why it's a practice that has to be profound.
One more?
Sure, I'm here.
Yeah. So Andrea Bisker asks, how can we start this revolution? With companies, with people? How can we do that?
So when I get asked that a lot, and I don't want to be the one-size-fits-all answer. So he's asking that. I always ask people to find out, 1, what's your metaphor of your life? If your metaphor is you're on a train and you sit there and the train takes you, then you say, well, if you want a revolution, is that the right metaphor? Because you're now on one train that goes in one direction. So you want to change your metaphor so something that allows more fluidity, a ship in an ocean where you have directionality. So first is for him to ask himself, is his life narrative the one that creates the change? Then the next thing I ask myself and others, what's my zone of control? If my zone of control is I can only change my local area, don't try to change the entire planet because you'll get frustrated and you'll give up. Change what you can. And then if you go further, this is where futures and macrohistory comes in. What's my vision? How do I use my vision as what's called a strange tractor? The vision pulls us forward. So then it's clarifying every day, what's my vision? So you have something that's far, that pulls you, something that's today that changes you, and something in between, which starts the process of expanding your zone of control. So that sets up your pattern, your possibility for not just today, but the next 5, 10, 50, 100 years. And well, what you're doing with W Futurismo is, well, let's do this together. That's the brilliance here. So yes, here's my zone of control, but let me meet with others and we expand our zone of control. And then you use the metaphor, the ripple in a lake.